It's almost 10 away from 7, the Friday edition of the South African Morning. Good to have you with us. I'm Gareth Edwards. Now, listen to the statement. South Africans are not happy with the state of democracy. It's a question for you, perhaps. Are you happy with the state of our democracy? Well, that statement is according to a study by the Human Sciences Research Council, or HSRC. Back in 2004, let's compare and contrast. 2004, about 59% of us were satisfied, not happy, just satisfied with how democracy is working. That number, though, has dropped significantly. Let's find out just how much it's dropped. As I say, good morning to the HSRC's Joleen Steyn-Kotze. Joleen, good morning to you. So before we talk about why we've seen this drop and how unhappy we are, what has the number dropped to? Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you very much. Well, currently we see democratic satisfaction levels quite low at around 32%. And as you mentioned, if we contrast that to the 59% we had in 2004, we are really looking at almost a level of, let's say, democratic commitment in crisis in the country.
So is the state of a democracy now becoming a state of emergency, or am I being overdramatic?
No, I think, we are looking globally. Also, I need to point out that when you kind of look at the global picture and the global state of democracy, there is what many refer to almost as a democratic regression. So less and less people are satisfied with democracy globally, and that is very often linked to your rising levels of global inequality as well.
So when we're talking about the state of democracy, how easy or how difficult is it to draw a parallel to the state of governance? Because are people unhappy with the way our democracy exists on a day-to-day basis, or are they unhappy with the way the government in the country is handling our democracy? Just help me understand, what's the measurement here? What's the metric you're looking at?
Well, generally speaking, and this is kind of also where it gets a little bit tricky around public opinion surveys on democratic satisfaction, because on the one hand, you have democracy as a political system. So, democracy in terms of the way a country is governed through free and fair elections, through processes of public participation and ensuring that there is public voice. Then on the other hand, you have democracy almost as principles, a commitment towards values of equality, of justice, of freedom, of liberty, of your civil rights. And generally what we see as well is that when we speak of democracy, there's also an expectation that in order to meet that equality criteria, especially in the public imagination, your politics of redistribution, your socio-economic goods such as healthcare, income grants, for example, free education, also start coming into play. And if a state is unable to effectively deliver on those social goods, then it almost becomes in the public imagination that our democracy is not working because my life is not necessarily getting better. Our society is still highly unequal.
And I'm curious to know, would we have seen a significant drop, Joleen? Let's just remind viewers about those numbers. 2004 satisfaction of democracy, the state of our democracy, 59%, at now 32%. I'm curious, did that drop significantly? Did we see a big dive during COVID when we had state of disasters and many of our everyday rights curtailed to keep us safe, or was that not really significant? I'm just curious.
No, it wasn't, especially during your period of COVID, reflecting on 2020, 2021, we're still working on those numbers. But your level of democratic satisfaction has not necessarily dropped significantly, almost in a post-COVID era, if one wants to call it that. So what we have seen, I think you can really start correlating it back. 2004, of course, was the 10 years of democracy. So there could have been a symbolic almost sense of, oh, wow, we are at 10 years of democracy. Now we are starting to push towards that 30-year mark of democracy, so 3 decades of democracy. We still see almost your spatiality of apartheid play out. We still see marginalization and exclusion, and we still see very high levels of inequality of opportunity that seems to shape the public imagination around kind of our ideas of democracy.
Joleen, I'm curious, forgive me if I'm putting you on the spot here. I always just like to compare and contrast since we're talking about democracies. Are you able to give us a sense of the state of democracy and how it's viewed in South Africa versus, for example, the rest of Africa or maybe even the rest of the world? Can you compare and contrast for us?
to a degree one can, because, when you cast your eye globally, there are serious concerns around, for example, the rise of populist politics, the rise of anti-democratic politics, the number of authoritarian regimes that have increased. Of course, also Europe is included in that narrative around concerns around the retreat of democracy. I do think what we also need to consider is that when you cast your eye across the African continent, we are actually a very youthful population globally. So, generally speaking, when we start talking around democracy, we start talking around equality of opportunity, we start talking about life choices. Am I empowered and enabled in order to meet those life choices? And generally speaking, when you look at high levels of poverty and inequality, the answer is no. So then the question becomes, okay, but what about, what do I do? How do I meet the goals that I have set out for myself? And this is kind of where the failing around perceptions of democracy comes in, because people start delegitimizing, so to speak, a political system on the basis that it has not delivered. And that creates almost a crisis of democracy, not just in South Africa, as I have said, but also across the globe.
I understand it was an incredibly in-depth study that had to be undertaken to get to these kind of numbers. But even as someone, Joleen, that works for the HSRC, when you got the study results back, was there something that made you sort of sit back and go, I didn't realize that, something that caught you off guard, caught you by surprise, going, I didn't think people would have that perception, or did you think that this is where the numbers were going to go?
No, I think for me what was quite interesting was that some of the, let's say, more qualitative, in-depth interview data was done roughly around 2017, 2018. And it was quite interesting for me to see how those perceptions held by interviewees actually played out within the latest round of our HSRC social attitude survey. And I think for me that really gives the opportunity to really start broadening our understanding around the expectations of what people had in mind when we speak of democracy, when we speak of freedom. As Fees Must Fall, for example, have highlighted very often in their narrative that when we talk of freedom, we talk of a prepaid freedom, so to speak. So if you have means, then you can get a good education, you can get good healthcare, you can have access to almost equality of opportunity. But if you don't necessarily have the means, then there is almost a sense of hopelessness, so to speak.
I really like that phrase, prepaid freedom. I feel like we're going to unpack that. Joleen, thank you so much indeed. Joleen Steyn-Kotze from the HSRC on this report that it seems we are very unhappy, or at least we're getting unhappier about the state of our democracy in this country. The number from their study dropping from 59% back in 2004, a very significant drop, now sitting at 32%. How satisfied are you with the state of our democracy? Maybe that's a good viewer question for some time next week. All right, we're heading